Hello, everyone. Thank you for joining us for this webinar, and thank you for your patience with our technical difficulties. As you know, you are joining our webinar on the budget. We're going to, in the interest of time, we're going to sort of jump through the early parts of this webinar, some of our introductory material about the Housing Assistance Council and our upcoming events. But lucky for you, this PowerPoint will be available after this training ends on our website, and the recording will be available by the end of the week, so you can come back to this. And but this webinar itself is on the administration's budget and infrastructure proposal and what's going on with federal spending caps. I am going to give you a brief introduction to Leslie Strauss and Stephen Sugg, who are both part of, amongst many other duties, our policy team at HAC, and I am going to hand it off to them so they can get started. Stephen, you want to go ahead?
Certainly. Thank you, Dan. In the interest of time, and because Leslie is going to get to the nitty-gritty of the HUD and USDA programs, I can be pretty quick with my part. I want to offer some context on the budget. And before I get too deep into it, I do want to share with folks that afterward, Leslie and I will share with you via email or on the website, whatever it takes, some links with some helpful information and follow-up. And doing the same webinar the last couple of years, some folks have wanted just a pretty broad overview, and others have had some pretty nitty-gritty questions. And we can share with you resources afterward, details on a specific program or baselines over the years, whatever it might be. So we have some helpful context, additional context that we'll share with you afterward. For today, I want to talk about a little bit about the overall budget. What is it and why do we care about it? And lots of you have already heard this year. As you heard last year, folks have said the president's budget proposal is dead on arrival at Congress. So why in the heck are we spending time on it? And there's several reasons for that. Number one is job security for us here. No, I'm just kidding about that. But the main reason we spend some time on the budget here is that it sets a baseline for conversations. The cabinet secretaries, Dr. Carson from HUD and Secretary Perdue at USDA, for example, will go up before their authorizing and appropriations committees and defend the budgets. And these budgets, they're a set of numbers and priorities, but they're really the administration's ideas, the administration's what's behind the administration, what they want to do going forward. So it's really kind of a value statement of what an administration values. And so it is important. With that said, Congress, via the Constitution, controls the purse strings, but the president does have veto power. So the president will get some of his priorities and whatever gets worked out, and the Congress will get a lot of theirs as well. You've heard a lot about budget resolutions, and I'll go into a little bit of that later. But budget resolutions go back years and years in Congress to get some discipline around the budget process. I can send you some background information on that. They're not a law, but they do sometimes in some years set a baseline for spending via the budget committees. Once the committees get these, what are called 302B allocations, which is inside baseball, it gets to where the stuff we deeply care about, the Appropriations Committee. And of the Appropriations Committee, there's subcommittees that fund things like agriculture and HUD. And folks in our field spend a lot of time looking at these appropriations committees and the amount of pie that they have to work with, and also where they're spending that. So we spend a lot of time on that, and we'll go right through that. And Leslie will go into some details there over the years. Now, if I gave you the textbook version, I would say that every year the president proposes the budget, and every year Congress spends the spring considering spending plans and bills, and every year by the October 1st, they've got a new plan in place. The reality is a lot different than that. You've heard of the government shutdown. Right now, we should be in FY18, but we're still in the FY17 numbers because Congress still hasn't quite finished up the FY18 process, even though they reached an agreement recently. So that's where we are right now, but that's how government shutdowns happen.
And in my haste to speed through the beginning, I forgot to mention that there is a Q&A pod in the bottom right-hand corner of your screen. If you do have questions for us, we encourage you to submit them through that Q&A pod. And Stephen, I'll hand it right back to you.
Oh, certainly. So that's where we are. So right now, Congress, as you all heard, a recent agreement a couple weeks ago, did reach a spending deal that averted for a little bit of government shutdown. So now they have until March 23rd to set the funding levels for FY18. This also set a baseline for FY19. But I'll go into some detail there, but more importantly here, these are political decisions, and things like the DACA, the Dreamers, infrastructure, broadband, and some other very contentious issues are all part of the budget negotiations and things like that. So those are all part of the context. Also, the recent tax cut plan that Congress passed, $1.5 trillion, has a tremendous impact on levels of available funding over the next 10 years or so for discretionary spending especially. Also, we're spending a lot of time over these years talking about non-defense discretionary spending, things like HUD, USDA, a lot of USDA programs, a lot of HHS programs, a lot of human service programs, but in reality, all those programs put together only make up about 16% of the federal budget. The other 16% is defense spending, which is called defense discretionary spending. And then about 60% of the federal budget is what's called mandatory spending, things like Social Security and Medicaid and Medicare. So we spend a lot of time in our field arguing about a relatively small percentage of the federal budget. That's what we're dealing with here. And the president's budget, low-income advocates believe that funding to programs like food stamps, education, domestic violence will hurt the poor. And they believe that the long-term trends for these programs are very hurtful to the poor, low-income people, and that the long-term trends, unless we do something about it quite soon, coupled with the tax cuts, really spell a lot of bad things for low-income folks. Advocates for the administration will say that the budget reins in spending and that it will unleash economic growth that will create jobs, and the jobs are the best social service plan. That's what we heard a lot from the administration last year. And one thing that's indisputably true through the president's infrastructure plan and everything else is that the administration definitely wants to turn things over more to the states and more to the private sector when it comes to things like infrastructure. So back in 2011, Speaker Boehner and President Obama created a Budget Control Act, and that had caps and sequestration, and that was supposed to put some fiscal restraints around Congress. And most folks would say, especially fiscal conservatives, that hasn't worked too well. We've heard a lot of talk of raising the caps, raise the caps, and raising the caps essentially means that the defense hawks want more money for defense spending within the budget context, and that folks who care about domestic spending, HUD, USDA, whatever it might be, want more funding for their priorities. And so Congress the last few years has raised the caps with what's called parity, with roughly the equal amount of money for defense and non-defense, and that's created a coalition among the left and the right to get these budget resolutions through Congress. So for FY18, there's about $63 billion more to spend on that Congress has to divvy up, but before March 23rd. And Congress is pretty good at spending money, but when they have to decide where it goes, it's a little more complicated. So it's not a guarantee they'll get this all spent without dispute by the 23rd, but most people think they will. And with all that done and with extra spending in the recent bill for the next 2 years for domestic priorities, domestic discretionary spending is still comparably low, even with the recent increases compared to FY10, for example. So lots of our friends who analyze this stuff will still remind us that spending for housing and other priorities like housing is still not nearly as high as it was 10 or 15 years ago. And I'll finish up right there really quickly, touch on infrastructure. The day before the budget came out, the president talked about an infrastructure plan. The numbers are quite big, between 1.5 to 2 trillion with a $50 billion set aside. But then you read into the details, it's only about 500 million in federal spending over the years with a lot of strings attached. And most of the money is private sector money that's using to quote unquote leverage public sector money. So it's not a lot of federal money for infrastructure, and advocates for these programs will also mention the president's budget proposes cutting a lot of the infrastructure programs like CDBG, for example, or rural water and wastewater programs at HUD. So it's hard to say how the Trump budget proposal, the Trump infrastructure proposal will really pan out over time. But we'll definitely keep an eye on that, and the conversations about that are intertwined with the budget conversations. And with that said, I can turn it over to Leslie, and I'll be happy to answer additional questions going forward.
Thank you. The budget agreement, spending agreement that raised the budget caps for fiscal 18 and 19 was passed by both houses and signed by the president on February 9th. The budget was scheduled to be released on February 12th. That was a Friday and a Monday. So the budget did not take into account the increase in caps. They were accounted for by the administration in a budget addendum that added money for some things. We'll talk about that in a minute when we get to HUD, but I wanted to mention that ahead of time in case anybody was hoping that it had any money in it for USDA rural housing. I'm afraid it didn't. The tables that we're going to show you include final funding for fiscal 16 and 17, but not 18. That's because the final funding for 18 is still up in the air, and we're still operating under the continuing resolutions that continue fiscal 17 funding levels. The fiscal 18 final funding levels for some of the rural housing programs may be different than the 17 levels. There are different numbers for some programs. The House bill and the Senate bill have the same numbers. Some of them, they have different numbers. That amount of information wouldn't fit on these slides, but it's available on our website in the February 16th edition of the HAC News newsletter, which can be one of the links that we send later. So this administration budget proposal for fiscal 19 will look quite a bit similar to last year's. Everything is zeroed out except for the guarantee programs. This slide shows you the single family programs with the Section 502 guarantee, which is the government guaranteeing loans made by banks and savings and loans and credit unions, I guess, to home buyers. That program and the multifamily guarantee that I'll get to in a minute are covered. Their costs are covered by fees that are charged to borrowers and wrapped into the loan amounts. So it's easy for the government to continue those and say those are going to take over everything that these other programs are doing, because there's no cost except for the cost of administering them. In case anybody remembers from last year and wonders what happened to the Rural Economic Infrastructure Grant Program, that was in last year's budget, and it's in the House bill for fiscal 18, but not the Senate bill for fiscal 18. It did not reappear in the fiscal 19 budget. It would have combined a couple of the single family programs, Section 504 grants and Section 533 grants, along with some other rural development grant programs into one lump of grant funding that then could have been divided up among those programs in different ways. But there's not a whole lot of point in adopting it for fiscal 18 if it's not continued in fiscal 19. So we can hope that that's not going to happen for either year. These are the multifamily programs. Again, everything is zeroed out except for the guarantee program. They're actually proposing a slightly higher level for 538 guarantees, which produce rental housing, proposing that could go up from 230 million to 250. Again, that doesn't cost nearly as much as the direct loan programs that they are, or grants that they are proposing to zero out.
And the direct program, just to clarify, those serve a lower income population.
Yes, thank you. Some of the single family loan guarantees go to very low income families, but a much higher proportion of them go to moderate income families than the direct loans do. And the tenants I don't remember the exact difference in the rent or the income levels of the tenants, but the tenants served by the 515 program and 514, 516 farm worker loans are much lower income than tenants served by 538 guaranteed loans. This slide shows you the rental assistance program. As folks probably know, rental assistance from USDA is available only to tenants that are in USDA financed multifamily housing under the 515 or 514/516 programs. We assume that this amount is the appropriate amount to fund all of the rental assistance contracts that are needed for the year. We can't double check the administration's figures because they don't release the information about exactly how much it all costs. In some budget charts, I've seen the number for the fiscal 19 budget says 1.351 billion, whereas here it says 1.331. That's because 20 million in the same line item as rental assistance is for the voucher program. In the past, the voucher program has been wrapped into the line item for the multifamily preservation and revitalization program, which again is proposed to be zeroed out this year. That's the MPR line. It's not entirely clear to me why vouchers would be wrapped in with rental assistance instead of in their own separate line, except maybe that makes it easier to switch funds back and forth between the programs. Going back for a second to the slide that I skipped, tenants receiving rental assistance, the budget proposes a minimum $50 a month rent for them. This has been proposed in legislation in the past and has not passed, but there is more support for that than there is for some portions of the changes in safety net programs. The idea being that because there would be a hardship exemption available, the $50 rent would not unduly burden any tenants. The latest figures we have available for the incomes of tenants receiving rental assistance are from September 2016. We hear, by the way, that the figures, what's called the occupancy report for the multifamily programs that has this kind of information in it, should be out soon with calendar year 2017 figures. But in September 2016, the average income for tenants receiving rental assistance in all USDA assisted multifamily properties was $10,732 a year. If that's your income, I don't know how you're going to pay $50 a month rent in Section 515 properties, which are occupied, majority of the tenants are seniors or people on fixed incomes. The average income is even lower. It's $10,504 per year. Going back to vouchers, trying to advance the slide. There we go. One more. Trying to figure out what the need is for vouchers. As I said, we don't have the data to verify the administration's suggested level for rental assistance, but in the past, rental assistance has been one program that has gotten the amount of funding it needs in order for tenants who have it to continue to get it so that they're not kicked out on the street or have to move out on the street because of their rents being too high. Vouchers, we do have more data available. So, for example, we know how much has been used in the last 3 years compared to how much has been appropriated. And you can see that the amount used is considerably higher than the amount appropriated for fiscal 15, 16, and 17. And it's estimated to be the amount needed is estimated to be much higher in 18 and 19. The extra money to get to the, I don't know if you can see my pointer. Can they see my pointer? No. Okay. I was trying to circle the numbers that I was talking about, but that won't help. The
Vouchers.
I'm sorry, I
Never mind, just go.
can't see the screen well enough. I'm wearing the wrong glasses. The extra money to make up the gap in 15, 16, and 17 between the appropriations column and the used column, that funding has come from the MPR program, the preservation program, because it and rental assistance have been combined in one line item, and the funds have been fungible between the two programs, which means USDA has been able to do less with the MPR program than could have been done, and has not been able to meet the MPR need, but they have been able to meet the voucher need. The budget says that the 22 million voucher funding, the level that was used in fiscal 17 was $20 million. The budget says that supported 5,600 vouchers. They estimate that 18.3 million in fiscal 18. I'm not sure where they get 18.3 million, because that's not the number, that's lower than the number in either the House or Senate budget, but they estimate that 18.3 million in fiscal 18 would support 4,900 vouchers. That's 700 less than there were in fiscal 17. And they estimate that the 20 million they're requesting for fiscal 18 would support 5,100 vouchers. So, whereas if vouchers keep growing at the amount that people, once they get them, renew them, and then the program keeps growing because more people become eligible for them each year, they are necessarily, they're not admitting it, but they're necessarily creating a big shortfall for 18 and 19, with hundreds fewer tenant households getting vouchers in 18 and 19, and there's no discussion of that fact, particularly in the budget. This information, by the way, comes from USDA's budget, Congressional Budget Justification, which is a separate document available on USDA's website. That is one of the links that we'll put up later. Not available in the budget documents that are on OMB's, White House's website. That's the extent of the USDA programs in the budget. Oh, I'm sorry, there's one more thing I wanted to say about vouchers. The vouchers are currently available for tenants in properties that had USDA mortgages that are where the mortgage is prepaid or where USDA forecloses on the mortgage. There are also increasing numbers of properties every year where the mortgage is maturing. It's just ending as it reaches the end of its term. Those tenants are not currently eligible for vouchers, but they lose their rental assistance if they had it, which not all of them do. They lose their rental assistance when the mortgage matures. So it would be very good for the tenants if language was added in appropriations bills saying that tenants in maturing mortgage properties were eligible as well. There's also a glitch in the language where it says how the voucher amount is calculated when you first get the voucher, but it doesn't account for the fact that your income may change in future years. And so there should be language in there that would adjust the voucher amounts periodically as needed. Okay, the next thing I wanted to do is just report on an update on USDA reorganization. Last year's budget proposed, and it has since been this has since happened, that there would be no undersecretary for rural development. Instead, there is, Ann Haslett's title is Assistant to the Secretary for Rural Development. That means she did not need Senate confirmation, and she doesn't have the rank of the 6 or 7 other undersecretaries in the department. Curtis Anderson was named Chief of Staff, and then shortly after that was named the Acting Administrator for the Rural Housing Service. Not clear whether there's an effort to turn him into the just plain administrator or find someone else to be the administrator. There were staffing changes. This was not in the reorganization proposal, but just to make sure that people know, Joyce Allen, who was previously the Deputy Administrator for Single-Family Housing, moved over and became the Deputy Administrator for Multifamily Housing, and Roger Glendenning, who, like Joyce Allen, has been there for quite a while at the Rural Housing Service, became the Deputy Administrator for Single-Family. It may not seem like those people are important, but I bet a bunch of you know that they actually are, that the characteristics of the individuals in those positions can make quite a difference for how the programs are run. So I'm going to move on to HUD very quickly. The numbers in this table with asterisks next to them are estimates from the National Low Income Housing Coalition, based on, remember I said that that there was a budget addendum. It included $2 billion additional for HUD, and the language of the budget addendum says mostly what that money would be used for, but doesn't place it all under particular programs. So estimating where it would end up, the Low Income Housing Coalition came up with these numbers for tenant-based rental assistance, project-based rental assistance, the Public Housing Operating Fund, and a couple of other things we'll see in a minute. The Public Housing Capital Fund, as you see, which is money that's used, as the name suggests, to improve the physical structures in public housing, that would be zeroed out and the money would be rolled into the operating fund, but the operating fund would be cut quite a bit. Going higher up a little bit in this table, you might notice there's a 0 for vouchers for homeless veterans, and the number for tribal veterans for homeless, vouchers for homeless veterans who are members of Indian tribes would be cut. Although not completely zeroed out. CDBG and home, which are both of which are used to support rural housing efforts, would be completely zeroed out. There's no way Congress is going to let this happen. Both of these are block grants that go through states, and they're very popular with members of Congress. Others are, don't know what happened to that one column there. The Homeless Assistance Program, which is the number that jumped way off to the right somehow, is the only one that stays at the same level as in fiscal 17. The others are either completely zeroed out, like Choice Neighborhoods, or reduced somewhat, like NAHASDA grants and HAPWA, which is Housing for Persons with AIDS. Same thing with these others, except for Section 202 for the elderly, which those asterisks again represent estimates based on the amounts added by the budget addendum, which indicate that Section 202 would get more money, but again, all the others would be cut a little bit, except for SHOP. That's the Self-Help Homeownership Opportunity Program, which would be completely zeroed out, along with the self-help program at USDA being zeroed out, which we saw in a previous on a previous slide, that helping yourself up by your own bootstraps can't include self-help housing under this budget. Pulling yourself up, I should say. HUD's budget for rural programs would eliminate, as I said, would eliminate SHOP. It would also eliminate the Section 4 Section 4 capacity building program, which includes some rural funds, and the rural capacity building program. The next two bullets, the Rural Innovation Fund and the Rural Housing and Economic Development Program, have not been funded for years and years and still wouldn't be. The Rural Housing Stability Program is something that was adopted, I think, in 2011, that falls under, its funding level is not a separate line item. It falls under the McKinney-Vento Continuum of Care homelessness programs, but it's not going to be implemented because under the administration's efforts to reduce regulations, one of the regulations that HUD withdrew in January, or said that they weren't going to promulgate, was the regulation that would have implemented that program. So rural areas will continue to get their continuum of care homelessness funding through the continuum of care process, but they won't have this alternative process. This was supposed to be an alternative to the continuum of care. Other agencies, despite the homelessness program staying at the same levels, the budget would eliminate the U.S. Interagency Council on Homelessness. It would eliminate most of the CDFI fund programs, although it would keep the bond guarantee program and the new markets tax credit, which was also preserved in the tax bill that passed in December. It would eliminate the Delta Regional Authority and the Northern Border Regional Commission. The fiscal 18 budget last year proposed to eliminate those two regional entities and also proposed to eliminate the Appalachian Regional Commission. This year, the Appalachian Regional Commission would be funded. It would not be eliminated. And there's no particular explanation as to why that one is okay to continue and the others are not. And I'm going to turn it back to Stephen to say a couple more things.
Certainly. Okay, as we wrap up and we talk about HAC'S services just a little bit, I was a little bit hasty when I talked about the infrastructure plan. I wanted to clarify really quickly. It's a 10-year, the president's infrastructure plan is 10 years at 1.5 trillion, but of that 1.5 trillion number, only 200 billion would be federal seed capital, and the rest of it would be from factoring in the public and private money from state and local governments and or private sector money for these projects. And several people have asked HAC about the rural set aside of the $50 billion rural set aside there. And of that rural set aside, it's for communities of 50,000 or less. And of that, the governors would distribute 80% of the funds. And they can use it for wherever they want. Highways, or even the administration's own website said it could theoretically all go to rural broadband, for example. So I just wanted to clarify a bit on that going forward, because these infrastructure conversations cannot be decoupled from the budget conversations. So if there's any questions on that, I just wanted to clarify that. And with that said, I'll turn it over to Dan to wrap up the webinar and begin doing questions.
If I can add one other thing on that rural infrastructure program, as Stephen said, 80% would be distributed by governors, 20% would be reserved for something else. Sorry, I'm trying to find it. For rural performance grants, which would be based on performance. So if you do better with your infrastructure, then you get more money for it. And so that 80% and 20% accounts for the entire 100% of the amount, right? But somehow, some portion of it would be set aside for tribes and territories being like Puerto Rico. Not clear to me how that arithmetic works.
We dug pretty deeply into the administration's documents there, and there's just not a lot of detail there. I think it's fair to say. Yes, and a lot of our partners in the rural advocacy community, RCAP, for example, put out a statement saying we appreciate the attention to rural infrastructure. There's also an additional budget addendum for the rural utility service to get started going a little bit faster on rural broadband. But with that said, a lot of the core programs, CDBG, for example, the rural water and wastewater programs at USDA are being cut in this. So it's hard to see. It's just those are also infrastructure programs. So that's what the advocates are saying.
So as we said before, there's a question and answer box in the bottom right hand corner of your screen. If you're wanting to ask us some questions, we'd be happy to answer them. And again, thank you very much for dealing with our technical issues as we got started, and thank you to Stephen and Leslie for getting through that in record time in order to get us to some Q&A. But I have a few questions already in front of me. So one of them was that previously HUD Secretary Ben Carson has said that housing is a part of infrastructure, or housing would be part of infrastructure. What did we see in the infrastructure proposal along those lines?
We were hopeful, and HAC wrote a piece last year saying that we think housing should be part of infrastructure, and other folks, including some non-housing people, have said the same thing. Unless Leslie has found any, I have found no evidence that housing is included in any of the president's infrastructure proposals. With that said, we've heard rumblings in Congress that they would like for infrastructure packages to at least think about housing, and we will continue to push for that. We believe that housing is shovel ready and ready to go, but we haven't seen that yet from the administration. And I think that advocates or members of Congress will probably ask that question of Secretary Carson when he comes to defend the HUD budget based on his comments last year.
Stephen, if I can ask you a question, do you know if hearings are scheduled yet on the HUD and USDA budget proposals?
I checked this morning, have not seen that yet, but if we do have that, we'll put that in the links. Those should be coming around relatively soon, we believe.
Yeah, because they usually do that. And just so folks know, for the USDA budget, there's usually one with the secretary, who is now Sonny Perdue, that deals with the whole USDA budget, and so it usually focuses on things like farm programs. And then there's one for rural development. In the past, that has been the undersecretary testifying, along with the administrators of the 3 RD programs: rural housing, rural utilities, and rural business.
Excellent. I have another question here. This is Leslie, you had mentioned the USDA's budget justification document. What explanations does that document give for the proposed cuts to USDA programs?
Not much. It points out that as I mentioned, the guarantee programs cost much less to administer than the other programs, and that USDA is carrying out, it says good things about USDA's housing programs and how important housing is. And in fact, it mentions in passing that housing is often considered to be infrastructure, which I thought was kind of interesting. But it doesn't explicitly say, we don't think these programs are needed anymore. We don't think these programs have proved their usefulness in the past. In fact, it talks about their past records of success. Just there isn't an explanation of any greater detail than in the budget documents themselves.
On the HUD side, Secretary Carson's note to the HUD employees said that he was cognizant of the fiscal, constraints that the country is in, and that's why they had to make tough choices, essentially. But he emphasized they tried to protect the elderly and the disabled while doing away with some other programs that had helped people over the years.
All right, and I see one more question here, I think, and it's basically sort of a two-part. A couple people have asked this question of it. What chance does this budget have of making its way through Congress? What are you hearing, Stephen, as you meet with people and anyone else at HAC, from people in Congress about this budget?
Last year, when the president's budget, which was relatively similar, especially on the USDA and HUD side, came out, number of very high-level members of Congress, Hal Rogers, for example, who was the former appropriations chairman, said that this is dead on arrival and we don't like it. And we've heard similar rumblings this year. But with that said, everyone's taking a look at it, and the budget conversations politically, as I said before, are intertwined with conversations about DACA, infrastructure, and everything else. And that when they do these end-of-the-year rushes to finish up appropriations bills, these things tend to get all tied together. So you can't, the politics overall on Capitol Hill feed into this budget discussion. But with that said, they're not taking it too seriously, but everyone's taking a hard look at it. Would you agree with that, Leslie?
Yes.
Okay.
Looks like we have a question from the field from Richard. Richard, we cannot allow you to speak. This system only allows you to type
Not
in
that we don't
your
want you to
questions.
speak.
We would be happy to hear your voice, but we can't have that work. So if you can type your question into the Q&A, or at this point in time, if you want to email either Stephen or Leslie that question, they'd be happy to answer. Stephen is Stephen at Rural Home, and Leslie is Leslie at Rural Home, surprisingly enough. But
And Stephen is spelled with a PH, not a V.
that is correct. So if there are no other questions, I think we are going to wrap up here. Again, we'd like to thank you for joining us today. Thank you for sticking with us through our technical difficulties. We're very pleased that so many people did stick around despite our issues. And as a reminder, the PowerPoint and the recording from today's presentation will be available on HAC's website, along with all of those links that Stephen and Leslie had mentioned later on this week. And we can get you the links probably fairly shortly. The recording takes a little longer, so that you might have to wait. But otherwise, thank you very much for joining us, and have enjoy the rest of your day.